what are you backing in the region?
Thanks. Thanks for the invitation to all of you to speak over here. Thanks, Cate. We see fintech as a means to eliminate inequality and lack of inclusion in the region. We as a development institution, as most of you know, follow what are the Sustainable Development Goals that includes access to financial services for all. And we do see, after many, many years of working with regulated commercial universal banks, we've seen that there's limits to what they can do when it comes to financial inclusion. And there have been great examples in other parts of the world, but also in Latin America, of how fintech or technology has solved the issues of inclusion. A good example of this is, for example, the Kenya experience with Safaricom that has been, through a mechanism that's called M-Pesa, has been able to go from less than 10% of financial inclusion to over 95% of financial inclusion through using fintech as a solution to that. So I think there's a lot of things that our region can learn from other regions in applying this. We have the systems, we have the technology, and we've seen over the last few years a significant increase of investments into this space to be able to access. So as a development institution, we have looked at fintech as a way of solving the inclusion space.
Can you share, since you've had exposure to some other global emerging markets as well, a little comparison of, again, some of the models that you see in those markets and how you might see those evolving in Latin America, maybe some pieces that haven't happened yet in Latin America that address financial inclusion?
Yes, I would say that in the places that this has been more successful, it has been looked at as a tool to include rural populations into the financial system. Africa is a great example. India, Bangladesh are also very good examples of how solving the financial inclusion space through technology is a good way to go. What happened in Africa, for example, many countries had very little access to regular telephone lines. So they leapfrogged from no phones to smartphones. They didn't have to learn or didn't have to live through the experience of investing in direct telephone lines. They went straight to mobile. So for many of those countries, the work and the effort of going into and working with smartphones is very small. There's no cost of leaving other things behind. And that's a bit of what we have to do over here in Latin America, is leave some of those ideas and technologies behind to embrace new technologies. So I think that is a good example of how this is done. In Latin America, for the most part, our populations are more urban than rural, but that doesn't preclude from us from using technology for this.
Great. And if you can just share any examples of what, the larger IDB group is doing around fintech, anything that's been invested in or any partnerships that you're looking at.
Sure. So IDB is actually 3 different institutions. You got the most well-known is the public sector IDB. You heard from our president yesterday. A lot of the work that we do with the public sector is helping governments adapt their regulations to the inclusion of fintech as part of the solution for financial inclusion. And many countries embrace it, but not all of them. So I think that working with the 26 countries in the region through the public sector being the largest influencer of governments is a good example. Second, there's a smaller institution in the group that's called IDB Lab. And what IDB Lab, that it was formerly known as FOMIN, invest in high-risk new technologies to solve inclusion. In some cases, is access to electricity, health, education, but there's a significant investment that this fund has done in investing in funds that invested in fintech. Now we're seeing the growth of a number of fintechs, so now IDB Invest, the institution I run, has invested in a number of already post-startup phase of number of these institutions. So a good example of that is Mercado Libre is one of the online institutions that very successful across Latin America. They've ventured into financial inclusion with Mercado Crédito. And we worked with them, particularly in Brazil, to be able to monetize some of those efforts that they're doing for financial inclusion and connecting that with capital markets. So that's a good example of how we worked with an institution that has evolved from connecting buyers and sellers into the financial inclusion space, something that Alibaba has done very successfully in another part of the world.
No, great point, because of course e-commerce is a significant part or opportunity for bringing people into fintech and through financial inclusion. So let's jump now to Zachary, who runs a private equity fund based out of Jamaica and investing across the Caribbean, Hyperion. And love to hear a little bit about the opportunity that you're seeing specifically in the Caribbean. What is the market that you're addressing, and what are the opportunities there?
Thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm happy to be on this stage with James and Cristina. It's my first time in Panama, and I'm very excited about that. So thank you for having me. So I am from Kingston, Jamaica, and we are a private equity firm that has looked at a number of investments in the region. We've kept a very close eye on fintech. But the way that we look at things is less so from the technology standpoint, because there is a lot of conversation about fintech. Sometimes it seems almost like as a buzzword, and people are talking about blockchain almost as a buzzword and Bitcoin as a buzzword. But at the end of the day, there is an actual consumer at the end of that transaction. So we try to focus more on what is the need or what is the gap that the consumer doesn't have access to, and how can we help to bridge that gap. To give you an example, in the Caribbean, only 65% of the population is unbanked. They don't have any bank account, there's no connection with any sort of financial institution. And then if you go further, an additional 20% is underbanked. So they're not really leveraging or utilize any banking services per se. So only 15% of the population is banked. So if you're talking about fintech, you have to be looking at it in the context of how can you use fintech to bridge that gap, to get that 85% participating in transactions that the 15% may have access to now. One of the reasons why they don't have bank accounts is because in many cases they don't have an ID or they can't be verified. So these are things that blockchain technology can help to do in terms of verifying who people are. And once you're able to verify somebody, once you're able to register them and bring them onto some kind of a system, then you can start to talk about how fintech can impact that currently unbanked or underbanked customer. So we see a large opportunity there because we still have a long way to go to get people into that formal system.
Yeah, you had mentioned when we were speaking earlier that James used the example of M-Pesa and the mobile sort of revolution in Africa, but that doesn't seem to have been as an effective a platform in the case of Jamaica, right?
No, and so we've looked at Africa. Thankfully, they've been able to leapfrog, as James has said, and go straight from having no phone access whatsoever to having smartphone access and being able to get up to speed in terms of digital payments. The experience in the Caribbean has been very different. And maybe that's because we actually have a very high cell phone penetration, and we have had now for the last 10 to 15 years. So having a smartphone isn't really anything that new to people. However, having a bank account and trying to do some sort of digital transaction is. And what the research has found is that there's a big trust gap. Okay, so people are accustomed to having a cell phone. They're quite cool to go to, the gas station or convenience store, put some cash down, top up their cell phone with minutes and go ahead and talk. But trying to get them to actually put cash on a phone and use a phone to do some sort of transaction, they don't trust it. There's a fear that if I lose my phone, I'm going to lose my money. So in Jamaica, for example, we have had 3 companies that have launched mobile payment systems. And of the 3, 2 are already dead. They just didn't work. And there's a concept when you talk about mobile transactions, which is you have to be able to have what's called cash on and cash off. So if you can put money on the phone, that's one step, if people will even take that step. But if you can't get the money off the phone, that's a problem. And in Jamaica right now, there's nowhere where you can go to and pay using your mobile phone. I mean, there are very few places. So you don't have a complete ecosystem that allows you to really have those people participating in a mobile digital transaction space.
Great. And so what can you share an example of how you overcome? It's a cultural issue, obviously. So you need to find maybe new strategies, new approaches, how to address that. If you can share the example that you mentioned in Barbados as a possible solution.
Right. So tell you a little bit of a side story, but then how it links back. I have a strong interest in electric vehicles. We looked at public transportation infrastructure in the Caribbean and found that there was a very similar situation, which is that most public transportation systems are broken. The assets are 20, 30 years old, they're diesel, they're inefficient, and they're heavily subsidized by the government. So we responded to a tender put out by the government of Barbados where they wanted to transition their public bus system to electric buses. And I can announce here today, as I mentioned to you, that we actually, as Hyperion, won that public bid. And so we will be working closely with the government of Barbados to transition their entire public bus fleet to electric buses. Now, how does this tie back into fintech and financial inclusion? While we're transitioning to electric buses, we're going to be putting in a cashless payment system. So people will no longer be able to go on the bus and drop the change or the bills into a pan, which is what they're doing right now. That means there's an initial opportunity to get them some sort of electronic payment platform in their hands. Our belief is that the fastest route to go is actually with plastic first before transitioning them to mobile. So of the population in Barbados, you have 286,000 people. Even if we assume that a quarter of the population take the bus, and it's probably more like half or 3/4, we will instantly have access to up to 70,000, maybe 100,000 actual customers that will now get a card in their hand and will have to load money on that card or an app and use that to pay for their bus. That's now getting them involved in an ecosystem where it's now easier to transition them to using that card or mobile payment in a retail environment. But you have to have an entry point for them because there really is no motivation right now in a cash-based economy to transition to digital payments. A laborer that gets paid the equivalent of $100 at the end of the week, he's quite happy to just take his cash, go to the market, pay for his goods in cash. There's no drawback for him. There's no cost of transactions for him. He's not worried about blockchain and trying to find a more efficient means to make a payment. It's quite efficient for him as it is. So our view is that you have to find a way to get them into the system and then gradually increase their involvement in a digital payment society.
Super interesting. And just one follow-up question there. I'm curious, does a system like that exist in Jamaica or anywhere else in the Caribbean? Or so are there, is there public transportation that you can pay with a card now or?
Yeah, so in Jamaica, we actually have a smart card now that you can pay with, but the whole system needs to be upgraded. There are people in Barbados, in Jamaica, that have prepaid card platforms with software that they've even written from scratch and that they own. And some of these already run on Visa or MasterCard rails. So it's just a matter of using local players that have existing technology and those relationships, but then putting in the hardware in the public bus system so that they can do the transactions live.
Okay, wonderful. What a great opportunity. So we've been talking so far about financial inclusion and getting the unbanked into the financial system through technology. In the case of Nubank, there's an opportunity to talk about those who may have already been in the banking system but were very poorly served. And as we all know, banks in Latin America, as in many places, tend to be oligopolistic and have very high fees, have poor services. So great opportunity to hear about this. Nubank is a remarkable story, and we have Cristina Junqueira, who's co-founder and chief marketing officer of Nubank. In the space of really 6 years, they've gone from a startup to a multi-billion-dollar valuation and are the 5th largest credit card issuer in Brazil. As you probably all know, Brazil is a really significant market. They are a larger card issuer than, say, Citibank, and they did that in about 3 or 4 years. So, Cristina, if you can just start maybe by talking about giving a little bit the trajectory of how Nubank started out, what problems you were looking to solve, and how you've evolved, how the business has evolved and expanded since its initiation.
Sure. Well, thank you and good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the Dubai Chamber, IDB, and everyone from the GBF organization to have us here. Thank you. Just a brief summary of Nubank's history. As you mentioned, we started roughly 6 years ago with the strong belief that technology, design, better customer experiences should be able to help us suffer less with financial services in Brazil. We could not just get used to the fact that we pay some of the highest fees in the world, some of the highest interest rates in the world, and have one of the most horrible customer experiences in the world in Brazil. So we started from that standpoint, from the consumer standpoint, and trying to figure out what really mattered and working backwards from there. And I used to tell my partner, David, who's our CEO, that, people hate banks, they especially hate credit cards in Brazil. They aren't loved anywhere, but they're especially hated there. And that we would need a lot of money to invest in marketing to actually turn that around and to make people care about what we're going to do. And what surprised us was soon after we launched, and we soft launched in 2014, so it has been roughly a little over 4 years. We were just so surprised to see that people were extremely ready for an alternative. What they didn't have was an alternative, right? And as soon as we started issuing cards, and people were just begging us to please let them bring their friends and family to Nubank, which was, just blew our minds. And over 80% of our growth has been organic thus far. We're serving now over 7 million consumers in Brazil. We're the 5th largest credit card issuer, on our way to be the 4th largest, on our way to pass Santander by the end of the year. And over 20, yeah. Very happy. And over 27 million people in Brazil have already applied for a card. And as it is a credit card product, we can't approve everyone. It's a credit product, but we're extremely excited since now we do have an account and a debit card to actually be able to include all those people that weren't able to approve for a credit card soon enough. So roughly 2/3 of our customer base now have already opened an account, and we're on our path to become also one of the largest debit card issuers, and to ideally serve tens of millions of consumers and help them, not be held hostages anymore of the incumbents banks and their extremely high inefficiencies and high fees and interest rates.
Okay, can you share a little bit more about, that differentiation? Because you're starting from the place of the consumer's needs, right? So what were the bad experiences that you were looking to? Of course, the high fees is a significant one, but in what other ways is Nubank working with its client base to, solve problems and give them services that they were not good before?
I think customer service is a big piece. So when we first started and we told people that we wanted to offer great service, people just, tell us we're crazy. It was a world that people were moving towards, outsourcing and cutting costs, and service was always seen as a cost center. And I tell people that our biggest marketing investment is actually our consumer service team, which is, over 700 people who are all full-time employees. They all speak English. They all went to good colleges, because you know what? When you're designing products and services, they're meant to work and work really well. If your customer is reaching out to you you have a problem. It's not the customer that has a problem. So what I tell people is that when that happens, we need a much more sophisticated interface to deal with that. We need someone that will actually understand the issue, will have the autonomy to fix it, and most importantly, feed the loop back into the product team so that we can fix that. Because it's often, either a bug or a communication that isn't clear, or the UX isn't quite there yet. So we absolutely got to close that feedback loop and make sure that more people are impacted by that issue. And that's how you feed into the engine. So customer experience, definitely a big part. The second part is just technology, because currently in Brazil, all banks have their own mobile apps, they have internet banking, but the truth is it doesn't really work. Like, you can put as much lipstick as you want on the pig, but when those apps are connected to these back-end services, there are, mainframes from the 80s that, barely work anymore, and they haven't really scaled well. There's a lot of limit to what you can do with an app. Even if in theory you can do something from an app, but half of the time it isn't even working because some of the batch processes are taking too long, and they've frozen all the platforms that you're meant to access now. Like that's just a very hard problem to overcome. So what we hear from our consumers, which are again always the starting point, is that it just works. Our experience just works. Our product works, and service is great, and they feel that they're, for the first time, they aren't being abused, that they can actually understand where their money is going. They can actually, for the first time, not get into the, to the bad cycle of credit card debt. So it's a combination of factors.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the specific products, even like you have, I know, different cards. I seem to remember there was a purple card that was incredibly hot that everyone had to have. And how you translated the experience with the cards into the savings product that you have. How is the savings product, addressing the needs of customers?
It's funny because when we first started, people were so surprised by the product, and it is a purple card. This is you probably haven't seen this because this is the newest version. So, and this card is very dear to us because there's a lot of breakthroughs on the plastic alone. We're the first card worldwide that doesn't have a signature stripe, and this was a waiver that MasterCard actually got us after months of us telling them nobody signs that crap anymore. Like, why are you forcing us to waste space on that? So anyway, it's also contactless. So eventually cards will go away. But the truth is, after the first few customers started getting the cards and using it, they were already asking us for an account. Once they saw how easy it was, how much more efficient, how much better the experience was, they were already banging on our door and saying, when are you going to give me an account? When can I have a debit card? So on the other hand, we were extremely cautious, and we wanted to do things right. We're in the business of doing fewer things, but doing them really well. So we only did credit cards for over 3 years, right? And that was before we gave ourselves the right to even think about an account, because we didn't want to be one of those startups that just grows and figures out things afterwards. We wanted to we want to build a company for the next 30, 40, 50 years. So it's really important that we get the foundation right. So after we had a brand, after we had a few million customers that were extremely well served, extremely happy, we started talking about the account, and we started trying to understand again from the consumer standpoint what was truly necessary there, and trying to get rid of as much complexity as we possibly could. So we launched the account product roughly a year ago. It was a great hit, and now with the debit card, we're seeing, I don't know, sometimes there are months in which there's over 500,000 people getting accounts in 1 month, which is amazing. Yeah, exactly. Incredible. So we're in our path towards a lot more growth and towards freeing, again, tens of millions of people from all the complexity.
I think this is a critical point around taking the time to really let consumer need and getting the product right, in place. I think, and sometimes you see in venture and in tech and particularly in fintech, racing to scale. There's a lot of money out there, frankly, for investing. I mean, China is a great example, and actually Tencent from China is an investor in Nubank. So when you look at something like the Chinese market, it's immediately billions and billions and billions, but sometimes maybe you miss that development cycle. The funding and the ambition to be large gets ahead of actually focusing on the value that you're creating in the consumer demand first. So it sounds like Nubank is really doing an amazing job with that. So, and I know one of the questions that Cristina often gets is, so are you guys in other markets? Are you expanding to other markets? And, if you could just share a little about, you're in Brazil now and where your priorities are in terms of growing.
Listen, we do get a lot of heat, especially when we look into China, into the speed that everything, and the scale that everything happens in Asia. But we got to find the right balance between going as fast as we can for sure, but making sure that the foundation is there. We often say that, if it isn't hurting, we're not going fast enough. So it definitely hurts, even as we grow and think about the long term and think about the right trade-offs there. But at the same time, we got to be mindful that it's really not useful to make long-term plans for us. Like as a startup, 6 months is like long-term, right? Like so much can happen, so much can change between now and 6 months from now. So we're currently extremely focused on Brazil. We're growing the account product. We're growing the debit card. We just started experimenting with personal loans. So that was, I don't know, maybe a month ago or 2 months ago, if much. So there's a lot on a roadmap on Brazil alone for the first half of this year. But we are like kids in a candy store. Of course, we look around and we see across Latin America a lot of oligopolies, a lot of high fees, a lot of high interest rates, a lot of people that don't have access. And we want to tackle those opportunities. But again, we want to do things one step at a time and make sure that the foundation is there. So for now, we're thinking about the region as a way to expand our talent pool. So we're definitely aggressively hiring across the region. So we've been to Mexico, to Colombia, to Argentina. We're trying to access as much talent as we possibly can because, with such large ambitions, such a large mission, we need any help that we can get, wherever that help is, wherever the talent is, and however it looks like. So diversity is also a very interesting angle for us. So that's our plans for now. We're essentially trying to form teams wherever we can get them and gather all the, to be the talent monopoly of the region, gather all that talent so that we can continue pushing towards that vision.
That's great. Of course, we've had a lot of important people from the public sector, the president of Panama at the conference yesterday, and other political leaders from around the region, and getting the regulation right is a critical piece. James, you touched on this. I would throw it to you first, and if anybody else has a comment, I'm sure you've had the experience in Brazil, Cristina, of what are the challenges of getting regulation right for fintech in the region, and what are the opportunities there?
Sure, and I think going back to the good example that we've seen with Kenya is the difference between Kenya and other neighboring countries that M-Pesa tried to work in was how open the regulator was to embracing this new way of financial inclusion. So that's the work that we're doing from the IDB side with a number of countries to embrace this, to not over-regulate it, on the contrary, to give it the space. Reality is today a lot of the regulations that we see in the region that are applicable to Universal Commercial Bank are precluding inclusion more than incentivizing inclusion. The track record that is required to open an account and a lot of the regulation that is imposed is hurting that. So I do think that freeing up, regulating it to a certain extent, but not having a special law for this to understand this, and we've seen this and incentivize this across the region.
Great. We're almost out of time here, but any quick moment from you, Zachary, on regulatory challenges or how you're working with the government in order to put these programs in place?
The regulatory framework in Jamaica and in many of the Caribbean islands is actually pretty robust, and it is somewhat encouraging of new financial products. I think the only thing that I would probably like to say in closing is just that for those around the world, for example, those in the Middle East, and thank you very much to the Dubai Chamber of Commerce, we'd encourage you to look at the Caribbean as a marketplace, because we're not just a group of little islands. If you add up all of the English-speaking islands in the Caribbean, you're at about 12 million people. That's the size of Belgium. If you add Haiti, you're at 22, 23 million people. That's bigger than Australia. If you add the Dominican Republic, you're at 33, which is as big as Canada. And if you add Cuba, then you're at about 44 million people, which is the size of Spain. So as a market, I think we are significant, and we look forward to more investment coming into the region. We have stable governments, governments that honor contracts with investors. And we look forward to anyone who is interested in investing in the region.
Great, thank you. And Cristina, I know it's been a road for Nubank with regulation. You got to have a banking license. Nubank has a banking license. You know, how well are you working with the regulators and the policy framework in Brazil today?
Listen, I was mentioning in the back, it was a long road, so it took us roughly 3 years to get to the banking license, and we feel like in a lot of ways, we've opened the path to newer companies and new startups to actually, go down the path that we went, and there are now like more modern frameworks for companies to start. But overall, even across the region, not just in Brazil, like we're seeing regulators more and more open to competition, to the impact that technology can have in terms of making financial systems more efficient, more modern, more inclusive. So if anything, it has been such a pleasant surprise to see how keen regulators are in terms of embracing all the innovation that has come into the fintech space. And frankly, to collaborate with companies like ourselves. So Brazil has recently issued a new regulation on cybersecurity, which is like a very hot topic for banks worldwide, for regulators worldwide. And it has our fingerprints all over it because it was a very deep discussion with the regulators, a lot of inputs from us being, the leading tech company in Latin America these days. And frankly, Nubank is currently doing things that are more bleeding edge than a lot of companies in Silicon Valley. So we were in the best place to actually contribute to that. We were so happy to see how open they were. So it has been nothing but a pleasant surprise, and we continue to look forward to engaging with regulators, not just in Brazil, but across the region.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much to all of the panelists, and thank you to all of you for being here. Super interesting discussion. So I guess we just step up this way.